It's Monday, April 29th. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. Today on the show, we're going to tell you what the poets are doing. We've got a load of local poets lined up to talk about the role of poetry in today's world. A world that can feel so fast and filled with information. Let's turn off that fire hose today and find a place for some poetry talk. And of course, it is National Poetry Month. George Murray, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you, Adam?
Good. So, marketing manager, Breakwater Books, also former poet laureate, St. John's, author, poet. We get in touch every so often about books. And thank you, by the way.
No, it's wonderful. You're very responsive. I love having our authors come in here and chat with you.
Tell us how today got created.
Today got created because we've got a brand new book of poetry by Agnes Walsh, who's a sort of a local treasure and our second poet laureate. Yeah, that's right. And the second or our inaugural poet laureate of the city of St. John's. And then after her came Tom Daw, and then myself. Then Mary Dalton, and now Mark Callanan. So we're well into the Poet Laureate program, but we wanted also to have Agnes's book get a little bit of attention, and it's called The Wind Has Robbed the Legs Off a Mad Woman.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And you're here to bookend the show because we've got there's only so many microphones in here. We've got four amazing poets plus yourself as an amazing poet. Before I let you go, though, that question, right? Like the role of poetry in today's world with everything going on.
Right.
And whether this is a thinking of social media and the fire hose of info where just everyone is making content all the time, as we say in the biz. What is for you, your thoughts? What's the role of poetry in today's world?
Well, I think the role of poetry is always evolving, but I think for us, and I think the one thing that it returns to every time is making sense of the condition of being human. So when we come into difficult times, like we are currently with the current news cycle, and have been since 2016 or so, just constantly trying to think these sort of, seesawing back and forth between existential dread and nihilism and so forth. Even people who don't have a lifelong relationship with poetry, they turn to it at those times. Someone dies in the family. Something happens. We need to make sense of what it is to be human. And that's what poetry does, is it provides us with that in a compact little space that allows us a moment for reflection, takes us away from our phones and into the page of the book.
How often do you write?
I write every day.
Every day?
Every day, yeah. In fact, actually, I split my time between being the manager of marketing at Breakwater Books and the other half of my day is spent solely on my writing.
Oh, so when I phone you in the afternoon to bother you, I'm bothering your writing?
You can bother me in the afternoon, not in the morning.
That's what it is. I knew it was one. It was one or the other. Cool. So thank you for helping set the table for this conversation.
Absolutely. You've got better people to talk to than me, and I can see them all here smiling, so they're ready to go.
Yeah, I think that we'd probably only have another 2 or 3 minutes on the smiles before they'd be like, what are we doing here? Why are they just having this conversation? So thank you. So you've already introduced everyone except for Allie Duff as well. Allie, welcome to the show. How are you doing? Author and poet.
I'm doing well, thank you.
Thanks for coming in. All right. Who should we start with? Agnes, I guess we'll start with you.
Okay.
How does it? You had your book launch yesterday?
Yes, I did, yeah.
How was it?
It was great.
Yeah?
It was wonderful. Yeah, it was a really good crowd, and it was so nice to see old friends, people I hadn't seen in a while. That I think the Ship used to be, that's where the launch was, used to be a big gathering place back in my day. Yep. And then all us older people backed off from it. And so when I went last night, there was lots of people that I used to see there. Yeah, so that was wonderful.
Excellent. And never having done this before, when you put together a book, right, you spend all the time putting it together. What's it like to kind of get it in your hands and at the end of the process and then do a launch and to get feedback on it and to have it out in the world?
Oh, it feels great. Yeah. There's no doubt about that. Yeah. I mean, I find the writing of, say, each individual poem is just that. It's never the thought that there's going to be a book. I just can't think that way, really. But then when there seems to be enough poems for a book and an editor comes on board, then that's when the real work begins, for me anyway. Yeah. And then, having it in my hand and liking the look of it was great. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, it is. I mean, it looks fantastic. So who did the cover art?
That's Frank Barry. He's a painter and a playwright, and he did that.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And your thoughts then on poetry in this world that we're in today and its role?
Well, I could probably just say my thoughts on poetry ever since I first read a poem.
Okay.
Because in a way, I find that the world hasn't changed a hell of a whole lot. There's always some catastrophe, it seems. And when I first read a poem, I just felt like my whole world changed, and I knew then that that's all I needed. I didn't care what I mean, I do care about what happens in the world, but somehow poetry is an anchor for me.
When was this first poem that you read?
I think I was around 11 or 12 years old, and it was in the public library in Placentia.
Wow.
I found an old leather-bound book, which I gravitated for. It was very thick, and I think I can't remember if it was Wordsworth or Longfellow, but it was one of the long-haired guys, and I couldn't understand what I was reading, but I knew it was another language. Like I thought, wow, this is English, but what is it? And the more I read it, the more I understood how it was another language that I thought maybe I could dare to do.
Huh.
So that was the beginning.
How long after reading it do you think you started?
Oh, probably that day.
Okay.
I think I started writing right
Really?
away. Yeah.
Mary, what about you?
Well, I'm listening to Agnes, and I love the story of the book in the library. I think when you say, what about me? What do I think about poetry and its role in the world, or how did poetry come to me? What?
All of us.
All of it. Oh, too much. I think that poetry is first and foremost pleasure. It's sound for me. It's the sound, and when you found this language, I would say something about that current of sound running through it. It's a patterned sound. There's the distinction when we're talking about writing and literary forms. It's not poetry and fiction and theater. It's poetry and prose, really. The poem is patterned, more highly patterned language. It's language in love with sound. The line is a really important feature. So for me, it's about pleasure. It's about music. Yes, George speaks about the there are ways, and perhaps its engagement with the human condition in some way. It does have content, it does have feeling, but so do novels, so do plays, so do essays, and it's that joy in the sound. And when I make a poem, and when I read a poem, it's that pleasure. And yes, that's it.
Oh, I think that's tons, right? Pleasure in it. Allie, what about yourself?
So I think Mary just made me realize something about my origins of coming to poetry. So when I was a kid, I was actually afraid to sing, and I was afraid to play music, which is funny because my father is actually a musician. But I had this great fear of singing in front of people. And I think maybe that's actually a little bit why I turned to poetry, because I was kind of writing songs, and that same draw towards cadence that I never actually realized that before. So that's a cool realization to have today.
This is why we brought you here.
Yeah, epiphanies.
Yes, exactly. I mean, this is what the show is all about. Mark, how you doing? Good to have you back.
Doing very well, thank you.
So, any thoughts on what you've been hearing so far, or just any thoughts on the overall question? Because we had you in a year ago, but it's great to have you back in again.
Yeah, no. From my own perspective, I think poetry has always been, because I seem to be, for whatever reason, kind of, let's say, divorced from my own emotional landscape and never seem to quite know what it is that I think about the world around me until I force myself to think about it. And the way in which I think about it is in writing about it, and which can often lead to some surprising revelations, almost as if one were talking to someone else entirely.
Like, do we have examples here?
Oh, geez.
You can be general.
Well, I guess I mean that experience is kind of raw and unprocessed and difficult for me to access until I turn the kind of poetic lens on it and then determine, oh, okay, it's interesting to know that now about myself, like the degree to which that particular thing matters to me, the emotion it elicits in me. It's not always readily apparent, not often readily apparent, in fact, until I start writing about it. And also in the act of reading other people's poems, and that this is part of the beauty for me of poetry, is that it is such, because of its use of the music of words, rhythm and repetition and rhyme and all that, it becomes such an embodied experience for someone else reading it, so it is effectively through that music transferring the thoughts of one mind into the mind of another, potentially wholly different mind, of a different gender or sexual orientation or ethnicity or from a different time period even. I mean, that's like, I don't want to use the term miracle because it's a bit loaded, but it's a kind of magic to think that you can enter into a mind that was thinking and considering the world around it 500 years ago.
Yeah.
Through book technology.
Right. Still here.
Yeah, still around.
Accessible.
Take that, e-reader.
Then with content, when you write,
Yeah.
Sorry for using that word, but when you write,
Oh, I'm a content producer.
you're an influencer. Mark. When you write, what speaks to you for the subject matter of what you do write?
Well, I've always been. I was kind of a morbid child, I think, in a lot of ways. I thought of death a lot. Yeah, really. I think maybe because generationally, when I was young, my father was a lot older than all the other kids' fathers. My mother maybe like a bit older, but not quite as old as my father. So in a lot of ways, generationally, I grew up with like a lot of elderly people around me, and there was a lot of like going to wakes and stuff like that. Yeah. So it's the sort of thing one thinks about. Obviously, it's coming for all of us eventually, as well. We know, and so I guess the ephemerality of existence, the short time that we're here, that's what most interests me, and I think it is actually probably at base that makes us make art, is the very idea that we have such limited time here makes it that much more precious, I guess, if that's not too trite. No, I mean, hey, it's true. Death is coming for all of us. We're not here for a long time, so. Yeah. Can I just want to jump in here. Can I read a poem? Not mine. No poetry. Of course you can. Go ahead. This is the whole thing. Let's just center us here on the subject matter. No, I just wanted to read. George had asked me if I could maybe read something by. Sorry, I had to cough. We have a button for that. Yeah, I know. It really well. This is great. Did I catch it all? It's by Al Pittman, who was born in 1940 in St. Leonard's in Placentia Bay, and was known as an educator, playwright, and a poet, among many other things. One of the co-founders of Breakwater Books, in fact, and died sadly in 2001. So this is a poem of his that I really like because I guess I was raised in the Roman Catholic tradition, but am essentially a godless heathen, though not a non-spiritual being. And this is a poem, I guess, about the religion of life and appreciating nature and all that goes on around us. And it's called Baptism. And it goes like this. How I should like to return to the fields and lie a while with new-grown hay, whipping my face in its breeze-blown gentle way. And stepping stones follow a living stream in winding cataract fashion down to the sea, and taste the salt sprayed my way by shore-crashing waves, and lift my eyes to the mountains behind, my heart to the sky above, and taste once more the sweet life that knows no confession and is in itself a sacrament of the living.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Al.
Thanks to Al, too. Anyone with anything jump out to any of the guests here in studio for thoughts on what we were just hearing before I ask some more about your own poetry?
I think that poems, Mark is raising really interesting philosophical questions about the origins and the roads that we take into poetry. And I'm just thinking, for me, I think it was much more basic, and it was much more to do with somehow this love of individual words. Words are almost like clay for sculpture, and also I think the context into which I was born, and I think Agnes probably have similar things to say, that my father played music. My parents sang. There were musicians around. They were the expressions, the rhymes. He would make up rhymes just about little things going on. There were a generation just before community bards in every community. There still is an enormous interest in poetry in the general population coming out of that tradition that I think perhaps doesn't get registered in public discourse as much. People assume there's this a stereotypical notion that poetry is mysterious and difficult to get at, and it's earnest, and it's yes, that it's somehow this sacred thing. But if we look at the number of ways that people have entertained themselves through poetry, when I read public readings, I often read some of my riddling poems because people love engaging in the process and love guessing the answers, and then they speak about something from the past. So riddles, songs, recitation, shanties, I think all of that feeds into how some of us came to poetry. But the mysteries are there, of course, as well, Mark.
Yeah, no, and
I find it easier to talk about the concrete.
Your point's well taken. I mean, I think that's for most of us, our first engagement with poetry is through song and nursery rhyme, and there's a very good reason for that. Like the chiming of rhymes, and that is a thing that delights children and still delights us today. And there's a certain I don't know, what do they say in like wine tasting, like mouthfeel, and just speaking, certain rhymes and rhythms, like Lewis Carroll, like "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves,
exactly,
guile and gimble in the wabe."
Yes,
right? Like what a ridiculous thing to say, but it's so fun to utter it.
Yes,
it tastes delicious.
Yeah.
Yes, and there are really interesting books that have been made. Leslie Harris, who grew up in Placentia Bay, a historian at Memorial and the president of the university at one time, he put together a book called Growing Up with Verse, and all the sources, like the hymns, the Wordsworth, the Longfellow, the rhymes down on the wharf, the shanties, and it's everywhere. It's in so many facets of Newfoundland life then and still now. And of course, some songs are wonderful poems. Not all songs are poems, but many songs are.
Yeah.
That just made me think. So I've been obsessing over this book here, which I have with me, which is called "Don't Read Poetry" by the American critic Stephanie Burt, which is fantastic. But she's saying something much like you are, that we have sometimes, and maybe because of the education system as it is, but we tend to have a very fixed, rigid notion of what poetry is or can be. And this book is basically arguing that there are so many different types of poetry that there's essentially something for everyone. She says, I'm just going to read this short line here. Don't read poetry. Don't assume poetry ever means only one thing other than maybe a set of tools for making things with words, as music means a set of tools for making things with sounds.
Exactly. And it's great that you brought up Stephanie Burt. Stephanie Burt's poetics allows for an appreciation of Newfoundland poetry that's drawing on our speech, our very vivid speech patterns, because she's written a good deal about my poetry.
Yeah.
Yes, has a very, very wide range of reference. I wonder if I might read some poems now.
Yes,
We're
please.
talking about poetry, but I think the best thing about poetry is reading poetry. So I thought I would. Adam, would you like to say anything first, or?
No, just that. Here we go. I guess other than the fact that we've got for everyone listening at the end of the show, we've got 3 books here to give away. So we've got Agnes's book, we've got yours, The Vernacular Strain in Newfoundland Poetry, and we also have an extra book by Breakwater from a previous show, Clayton B. Smith's book, A Seal of Salvage. So you going to do the riddle ones now?
Yes, and. Yes, so
if you can figure out the riddle, email us or text the show, and if you get it right, you'll win. One of you will win this great 3-book package. So the email, thesignal@cbc.ca, or text us 709-327-8206. Go for it.
Right. So I'm going to read a few riddles, and I assume if people could guess any of the riddles. And I will read them twice because it's unfair to do this on the radio. They're very short. Oh, you may judge it bluster, but I'm the most stupendous of travelers. They speak of me from the Pole to Cape Horn. All a quiver, they dub me prima donna, say I relish melodrama, savor a tornado or a good typhoon. Oh, you may judge it bluster, but I'm the most stupendous of travelers. They speak of me from the Pole to Cape Horn. All a quiver, they dub me prima donna, say I relish melodrama, savor a tornado or a good typhoon. Now, the traditional structure of these riddles is, in a sense, who am I? Who's the speaker? And, of course, the speaker can be a dog, a table, a rock. Any inanimate object can be brought to life in a riddle. Great audio sound, the rattling of paper.
It gives ambiance.
Oh, it's all very well. When you're tired or you're down, you creep to my altar, slide into my trance. You know how to push my buttons. Then for days you ignore me. One day you'll find it harder to leave me. It's your comfort I think of. I squat here and wait. Oh, it's all very well. When you're tired or you're down, you creep to my altar, slide into my trance. You know how to push my buttons. Then for days you ignore me. One day you'll find it harder to leave me. It's your comfort I think of. I squat here and wait. Small as a flicker, huge as a mountain, wind's my fickle friend. Tame me, I'll serve you. Turn your back, I'll devour you and all that's about you. Small as a flicker, huge as a mountain, wind's my fickle friend. Tame me, I'll serve you. Turn your back, I'll devour you and all that's about you. Once the woods were my home. I had a sure footing. Now I've learned to love flux, where it's all ups and downs. I'm the wind's painted plaything. Once the woods were my home. I had a sure footing. Now I've learned to love flux, where it's all ups and downs. I'm the wind's painted plaything. And here's a riddle with a great social message, so we can show that poetry does indeed have an earnest. All
right, go for it.
It's earnest. I'm a jaunty fellow, a sparkling guest in my thin white suit and my jolly red hat. Invite me in, you'll wish you hadn't. A convicted thief, I'm hard to evict. I'm a jaunty fellow, a sparkling guest in my thin white suit and my jolly red hat. Invite me in, you'll wish you hadn't. A convicted thief, I'm hard to evict.
All right, thank you for that. So that's Mary Dalton there, reading some. If you can, if any of those riddle poems, if you have an answer to any one, send us an email, thesignal@cbc.ca, or text us, 709-327-8206. And just even entering in this, you can win an opportunity to win the book package that we have to give away at the end of the show. This is The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. It is National Poetry Month. Today we're talking about the place and the role of poetry in today's fast-paced world. Here with us in studio, all poets. So we've got George Murray, Agnes Walsh, Mark Callanan, Allie Duff, and of course, Mary Dalton there. One of the reasons why we're talking about today's show is because of Agnes's new book, The Wind Has Robbed the Legs Off a Mad Woman. Some of the poems in here, season is a big part of it. Mm-hmm. Nature, there's a poem about the migration of whales. One you'll be reading about a summer day. Another could be about fog or a different, like the sun setting, I guess, maybe November type month. What is it for you, and whether it's nature or the season, that really kind of influences your writing, your thought process, and as it connects to people?
I think, excuse me, I think it is just sitting in nature, and I do a lot of that.
Yeah.
Out, especially in the spring, summer, and well, all year round. And you can't help but notice it. It's right there. Yeah. And I think a lot of poets are relatively still people, so it's not hard to look. And if you look and you're a poet, you're just driven to write. That's the way it is for me, anyway. I don't really ever plan a poem that I'm going to write about a flower or an evening or anything like that. But if I let myself move through any of these things, there's something always comes up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then your favorite sitting time, summer.
Yeah, it's warm. Evening. Actually, the editor of this book noticed that an awful lot of the poems in here, I'm in a car, I'm driving.
Yeah.
And I do think a lot while I'm driving about, I don't think about poetry. I look at what
think.
And then when I get home, there's something about driving for me that really opens up poetry.
And so are you like George? Do you write every day? How often do you write?
No, I don't write every day at all. I since this book came out, so it's been about a month, and I haven't written anything at all.
Okay.
But I know my next project. It's already lined up, and I have a 30 or 40 poems already. But no, I think more in terms of projects instead of not projects, but a big kind of mess of ideas that usually move around one theme. And so, no, I don't write every day.
Okay.
When I'm in that project, I write every day. Yeah. Yeah.
And Allie, what about yourself?
Sorry, what was the question?
Oh, just how often do you write?
Oh, I am very sporadic. As maybe you just noticed, I'm very distractible. So, yeah, I have a little bit of I have a hard time sticking to any kind of routine at all. I've tried to make myself write every day. It lasts for maybe 2 weeks or so, and then I'll drop off. I could go a whole month without writing. There's a lot of guilt that comes with that. I'm trying to mitigate that and just kind of go with the flow more. I still managed to write a whole book, so I think it's fine.
Yeah. In my notes, it says to ask you about dead butt syndrome.
Yeah, I did write a poem. When I was living in Ottawa, I developed something called dead butt syndrome, which is real. That is a real syndrome. It's when your glutes and hamstrings get weak, and it often happens when you're sitting a lot, and it was during COVID. Yeah. But I was also biking a lot, so I didn't understand how that happened. It's like, oh, it's Ottawa. It's very flat, like my butt. So I wrote a poem based on that. It doesn't reference the name of the disease. It's just about kind of doing everything you possibly can, or you think you're doing everything you can, like trying to write every day, and you just still feel inadequate and end up with a dead butt.
Very good. Well, thank you for that. It's not often I just see dead butt syndrome in my notes, and I'm just like, I have to ask this and get the full story behind it. So
yeah, that's pretty much it.
Excellent. I'm just thinking, with social media these days, not all of us are on social media here. Some of us are. There's more accessibility for poetry than ever before in a way, but at the same time, I started the show by talking about the fire hose that is the world and all of the information out there today. What do you all think about just that accessibility side of it? Like, I find, just even preparing for this show on Instagram, I was like following a bunch of little poetry handles that just had folks, some actors, some others who are reading poetry. And for me, I was just like, it was such an interesting entry point for me. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, I think I'm not a great user of social media, frankly, because I just find its incessant nature overwhelming. Yeah. So on the one hand, I agree with you that it does allow for a greater number of points of contact where people can encounter things they wouldn't otherwise and come across poems they would have never known about. And every now and again, like, a poem will kind of go viral. There was a Maggie Smith poem a few years back called Good Bones that just like swept around the internet, and so this happens. But like, from my own perspective, I guess I find it more daunting than anything else. Like, I tend, with that kind of overflow of information, I tend to just block it all out and shut down. But I'm not the audience for social media, I don't think.
What? Because I was looking at just Rupi Kaur, right? Yeah. And her, just from going from a self-published book of 15,000 to just lighting the world on fire for poetry, being sent in, doing like the Tonight Show or all, and it was all the late night ones, and having like a couple million followers on Instagram.
It's quite impressive. Like, she's essentially kind of created a subgenre of poetry and Instagram poetry, and then it's quite impressive.
Yeah, for that, her initial book was Milk and Honey, I believe.
Yes.
I'm trying to have poetry memory. Right? Just go back like that.
I see that.
You see that? You see me? George.
Well, I was, it's one of the interesting things. I have to use social media because of my job in marketing and various marketing-related activities. But I find that this noise, this generalized noise, a few years ago I wrote a book about distraction, and the idea of it was that I realized that I wasn't, when I was in certain things, Agnes was talking earlier about driving. That's the only time you can't look at your phone. That's why we're spending so much time thinking when we're driving and so forth. But I used to do that when I was standing in line at the grocery store, when I was waiting for the laundry to be done. If I was cooking something in the kitchen, I had books around, or I was thinking. Now I have a phone and I can flick it open and I can get these really easy, quick dopamine hits, from flicking through Instagram and seeing a cute cute kitten, or over here I can, hear a new song by so-and-so. And there's never any time that we are bored anymore. And so there's never any time to think. And that's what the nature of that book was about. But it's also why we get poems when we're doing things like driving, or right before we fall asleep at night, or first thing when we wake up, because we are outside of that sphere of constant amusement.
I think it's why I like running so much, because I don't check my phone when I'm running. I'm just out in nature. Sometimes I don't even listen to a podcast when I'm running, because I just like to enjoy it and be immersed in what's around me and to think about it. And I think that's still maybe a couple steps away from writing a poem, but still, we're approaching the ballpark.
But everybody does that. Everybody writes poems in their heads.
Yeah.
I personally believe that every single person, it doesn't matter, you're a doctor, you're a plumber, you're somebody who works in an office in a cubicle, you're always having these moments of connection with the universe, or moments of connection with yourself, and you're thinking these things. The difference between the average person and the people in this room is that we've spent most of our lives training ourselves to recognize those thoughts and write them down and capture them in what we hope is the most beautiful and elegant way possible. But everybody has those poetic thoughts, those moments of epiphany and connection. They're looking at dust motes floating in a sunbeam, and they're thinking, geez, there's something big here. What is that big thing? The difference between all of us is that we go out and write a poem about it, and somebody else, it just passes on through, and it's a lovely moment that they had.
Yeah.
That's very well said, George. And my experience is that there are a great many people in the Newfoundland culture who are writing it down. It seems now it may be that I would encounter more of them when I was teaching creative writing at the university, but truly many people write poems. They write poems for someone who has died. They write poems for people's birthdays. They write poems for to record significant events in the communities. They don't get published necessarily, but as you say, everyone has those moments, and it's a feature of this place that tradition to some of recording in verse significant moments is still happening. And
I love the internet because I can go on there and listen to poets read that I wouldn't normally get to hear. Like, I'm a big John Ashbery fan, and it's even hard enough to I guess you can find his books on Amazon and everything now, but when I hear him read, that's a whole other world that I don't get from just reading him. And plus there's interviews with writers on there from all over the world. So I love it for that.
Yeah, that's the accessibility bit that I love about it too,
Yeah.
right? Like I was saying, I know mine was like an Instagram example, but it's whether it's anything online from YouTube to whatever else. It is just kind of, there was a poem the one I was mentioning that I watched the other day, and it just kind of popped up randomly. I think it was Michael Sheen, the actor, was reading, right? So the Welsh actor, and he was just reading this. Like, it was just a really impactful poem. Do we have that? We do have it here. Take a listen. Pop on your headphones for a second if you don't have them on, or share them for two of you, and just take a listen to this. I think this will speak to what I was trying to talk about.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. The wise men at their end know dark is right. Because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight and learned too late they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse. Bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
I was an obsessive Dylan Thomas fan when I was about 18 years old. And at the university library, they had a recording, Caedmon recording, I think, of him reading a bunch of his poems, which I made a copy of on audio cassette for my own personal use.
Thinking of accessibility, Adam, I would say you would find it really interesting to hear Dylan Thomas reading that too, because you'll find him. One can find him online too.
Yes, yeah. And he had such a great lilting voice.
Similar, highly rhetorical manner as this reader.
Although, you know what? I
is
just
going.
remembered in first year university, I had to do a French presentation, and I did my French presentation on Dylan Thomas, and I played him reading, I forget which poem now, maybe even that, and nobody else got it in the class. They were like, I don't like his voice. And a little piece of me died.
That's always been my fear with it, right? With just for when I've looked at poetry, it's just been feeling whether or not I'm allowed into the room. It's like, who do you think you are to write poetry? And this is, I think, from because we're around the same age mark. Like, I think it's just from the upbringing at the time. It felt like it was this thing that, like, unless you were really smart and like good with words, it wasn't for you. And even though I've been interested in it, it always felt like no, it's for folks who are way better.
There's a great book. The British writer, actor, comedian Stephen Fry has a book called The Ode
Less Traveled.
The Ode Less Traveled is what it is. And Stephen Fry is a practitioner of poetry. He's not like a professional poet. Yeah. He's just someone who enjoys writing poetry. And it's a book kind of geared to other people who, you know, might be interested in just writing poetry for their own amusement or, you know, diversion, which is an interesting idea because, like you say, we tend to think of it as a, well, one esoteric kind of art and something requiring great intellect and this, and not something that anybody can do and anybody can derive joy from, which is the case.
Do you want to read something for us?
Sure. I will read a poem about daffodils. I think we need them.
Oh, especially today, if you're, folks. A provincial show, but if you're in around St. John's today, I don't even know if there is an outside right now. We're so encased in fog. So yes, please.
And it's cold and dreary. Yeah. Okay. Their leaning makes me nervous. They're like a drunk who almost falls. And a bunch looks like it could gang up on you in legion. Or they can look like a choir as it sings through the corona, trumpeting that he has risen. They're cocky, too, because they have poison, the lycorine, but they also have hope. No scent? What? Is fresh not a scent? They think they're upper class. And look, battered by a cold spring, see how they shake off the slushy snow, come through with that full-faced, self-satisfied smile.
I'm picturing it now.
We hope they make it through.
Agnes Walsh, thank you so much for reading that. And remind folks again, so when you said you don't write a poem with the thought of an eventual book, right? But as you go through the process, they start to kind of one after another, when does the point come where you're like, hey, I've got something to kind of deal with here and to look at?
I think when I maybe have at least 60 poems or more, but then they all don't make it into a book. But and then there's the process of going over and getting rid of poems and writing new ones. I've actually, with this book and with the other books I've published, sometimes the day before it goes in, I have to have this other poem that I wrote 2 days ago. So it's kind of unpredictable.
Allie, what about yourself?
So For the book that I did write, it is kind of just a mix of random poems. I just got to, same as Agnes, I got to a certain amount. They seemed somewhat on similar themes, and then I grouped them together, and there was the book. But I am currently trying to write a book about women who choose not to have children. And I find it a lot harder to have like a topic and try to write because it feels a little bit more contrived, and unless things are happening naturally, it's definitely more difficult.
So then how do you kind of keep pushing ahead when it's a little more difficult? You're feeling, like you said, it's a little more contrived, but you're still you got the goal in sight or the idea of it. How do you keep moving through things?
I think research really helps me, and getting inspired by other people's writing. I read a lot of non-poetry. Like, I'm just reading essays about women who don't have kids. I'm talking to people. And eventually some ideas happen and some poems come out of it.
I'm looking at my notes again. Congrats, recent winner of NL Arts and Letters Award, right?
Thank you.
And wasn't there a connection with someone else here? Who presented that to you?
We were jurors on that,
Oh, there you
myself
go.
and George. But it's an anonymous process, so you never know in the act of judging.
Who does it?
Yeah, though one is always curious, especially
Yeah.
when you find something that's really good. And you're like, whose poem is this now?
And so then,
sorry,
go ahead. No,
no, I was done.
Oh, I was going to say, so yeah, like I was curious about the process of like when you, and George, if you want to jump in too, like when you you're looking over stuff, like what's that process like to be a juror on it, to enjoy, like you mentioned wondering who it might be and enjoying it. So how did George, how do you feel about it?
It's a wonderful process. I mean, it's difficult in a way. Some certain ones jump out as much more accomplished in craft, and others jump out as having more heart, and others jump out as having wonderful, sort of a rawness to them. But it's, as we said earlier, I mean, it's amazing the number of people that are writing these. Every time, I've judged it a few times now, and every time there's an increased number of people sending in these poems. And, when I teach poetry, I teach it the way one might teach something like carpentry. I think anyone can learn to saw a board and put together, nails and screws and so forth.
Spice rack.
Yeah, and put together your spice rack in shop class. Anyone can learn to do that and take pleasure out of it. Now, there's a certain person who then goes on from that and becomes a fine cabinet maker, or becomes a furniture designer, or becomes, some kind of a wood turner, or something that has a more artistic flair to it. But everyone can build that little spice rack and enjoy having done it, and then use it in their lives, right? And that's what poetry should be taught, I think, less as a mystical art and more as a practical art.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Looking ahead then, we've got some projects we're working on. We've got a book just out. We had a book launch. What else are we all working on now, or what else is in the forecast for you all, for your professions and what you're doing?
I'm working on a new book.
And I have a book coming out in the late fall. I have a new book with the intriguing title of Interrobang, a word most people haven't met, but it's fun when you check it out. Interrobang.
Tell me more, or what more can you tell us?
To dwell on the title, the book itself contains various sequences that have appeared in various places. There's one set of poems focusing on the corner stores of Newfoundland, small communities. That's actually coming out in an anthology as well, being published by Memorial University Press as part of a larger book about corner stores. There's the set of riddling poems that I read a few from. There's a sequence called Waste Ground that is an ironic title. It's about how people ignore the plants around. There are so many plants that are full of nutrition and that have very interesting mythological histories all around us. And then there's a set of poems called Alba. But the Interrobang, there are a couple of lines in the book. There's a poem called Punctuation Marks. And in that, there's a couple of lines, something about the Interrobang, the prince of ambivalence. The Interrobang is a punctuation mark that was invented. It's really fairly recent, 1960s. It's a fusion of the question mark and the exclamation mark.
Huh.
It is, so what? He said that? You know, the combo when you're actually asking a question and you're amazed or indignant or, so that's actually, I'm reading my editor's annotations now, and that's all coming out from Vehicule in the late fall. I'm currently trying to get my podcast that got sideswiped by COVID and other things back, Flahulik. So there are people here whose work is on the Flahulik podcast. They haven't heard it yet because it's yet to go up. And yes, and poems come, but that's it.
All right. Mark?
Well, I've got a couple of book projects I'm currently working on. But what I'd like to tell you about...
Hey, go for it. I love it.
No, as part of the laureateship, St. John's, City of St. John's Poet Laureate, one of the things I'm hoping to do as a longer-term project is I want to actually make an online audio archive of poets reading their work.
All right.
There's websites kind of like that, like poets.org is one of them, where you can go look up a poet and, read a poem and hear them read it as well. Because I think the way in which a poet reads their own work has always been of interest to me. I talked about Dylan Thomas earlier, and to tie back to the internet, like there's so many things you can find. There's a recording online you can find of Alfred Tennyson reading The Charge of the Light Brigade on Edison cylinder, right on a wax cylinder, early recording technology. And he sounds like he's speaking from beyond the grave, which in fact he is. Just the notion of being able to hear a poet's voice, the warmth of their human voice reading a poem also does a lot to break down, I think, whatever notions we might have about poetry being beyond us because of the humanness of the human voice, Natch. So that's something that I would, I'm hoping to get done, and probably starting with recording the laureate poets, Mary and George and Agnes and Tom Daw as well, and then hopefully building a larger archive as I go on, kind of thing.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I love it. Let me know how that goes.
All right.
We got each other's number.
I will do.
George, what about yourself? Personally and also professionally, or professionally both, anyways, for poetry and also the company.
Yeah, when I'm writing, I say I write every day. It means I sit in front of a computer every day.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean I'm always writing, but I'm working on actually a book, a nonfiction book, where I'm talking about exactly what I just said about teaching poetry and how I teach it to people who have a broken relationship with poetry or who always wanted to try poetry but have never been able to really overcome the fear that was instilled in them by their high school teachers. So I'm trying to bring it to a different group with that book.
Folks, we're out of time. Thank you so much for this today. I appreciate the poetry conversation.
Thank you.
Looking ahead to tomorrow, as we always do on this show, we've got folks coming in to talk about co-ops and how to incubate a co-op. And you'll find out what that means all tomorrow. But for today, for all the poets here, George Murray, Agnes Walsh, Mark Callan, and Allie Duff, Mary Dalton, thank you all so much. And folks, we'll do it all again tomorrow, so do not go anywhere. Or actually do go somewhere. Come back tomorrow. There you go.